Thank you, Pavel, for the introduction. And I want to start by thanking Brian for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a real pleasure to reread this work and try to reflect on how some of Peter Armitage's work has been influential on my own and how I hope it will continue to be influential after this. So before I start, the title of my talk is Revisiting the Search of Optimality in Clinical Trials. This was a paper Peter Armitage wrote in 1985 in the where he published it in the International Statistical Review, and he published it in response to a paper published in the same journal on the same year by Professor Villar. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I chose that paper for this talk. What I want to do is to talk about that paper and how it influenced my own work. So for those of you that don't know, and here is a bit of a personal note, I started working in the Biostatistics Unit in 2013, so almost more than a decade ago. And when I started working here at the Biostatistics Unit, I had come fresh from my PhD in Spain, where I was working on multi-arm banded models. And I was trying to show the existence of certain types of solutions that are called index policies and try to compute them in a tractable way. And as part of my PhD, which was really disconnected from clinical trials, every single technical paper I read in bandits started with saying, and the typical application of bandits is clinical trials. So naive me, I was convinced that this was the way that clinical trials were actually run. And so when I came here to the Biostatistics Unit and I started talking to people that were actually involved in clinical trials, no one really knew what a bandit was. So that's where I started thinking, what's this connection between theory and practice? And that's how this paper in 2015 was published with Jack Bowden and James Weiser, where basically we were trying to answer that question and see what are the benefits and challenges. And as part of that specific paper, I read a lot of papers. And I didn't have the privilege to meet Peter Armitage, but this was how I met Peter, reading this paper. And so I read that paper of 1985, and I thought, oh gosh, Peter has answered the question before me quite a long time ago. So I included that citation to show that. So this is a citation of my own paper, where I cite his paper. I was saying that despite this apparent near fit between the real-world problem and the mathematical theory, the multi-arm banded problem has yet to be applied in an actual clinical trial. And so instead of trying to word what Peter had said, I just included the quotation. He said, either theoreticians have got hold of the wrong problem, or practicing trialists have shown a culpable lack of awareness of relevant theoretical developments, or both. In either case, the situation does not reflect particularly well on the statistical community. And I really like that citation. So what I want to do now is, the first part of my talk is to try and revisit the paper for you. It's a very short paper, tell you the high-level ideas that he presented there. It's a really nice paper to read. And then after that, share some of my reflections of what I think has changed, what I think remains the same, and where we can see Peter's vision, and some final remarks. So let's go to Peter Armitage's paper overview. So as I said, I'll start with a very high level and then I'll zoom in. So the paper was written in response to this paper that was written just before. And Armitage says, well, that paper and many other papers are doing this technical work that is devoted to the construction of schemes for optimizing some measure of the outcome clinical trial. And then he moves on and say, in this literature, which is quite abundant by then, there are two main ideas. The first idea he called data-dependent allocation schemes, and the second type of idea is decision theoretic models. And he described the basic ideas of both of these streams of work. After doing this at a high level and with no formula, he described really well and very, very rigorously the two ideas. He then moves on to saying, well, I'll describe the current state of clinical trials methodology, that is back in 1985, to be able to discuss why I think these ideas remain largely unused. And the paper concludes with a very well-argued call for closer collaboration to put ideas into practice where the situation makes them suitable. So the what and the why. So as I said, Peter writes, Villar in 1985 wrote this paper, which falls within the extensive body of work which seeks to set up theoretical models for clinical trials and to derive optimal or near optimal solutions to rather rigidly formulated problems. over the last 20 years or so, this has found no application whatsoever in the actual clinical trials. So he says, and these are his words, my purpose in this paper, therefore, is to consider some of the main features of the theoretical models, to inquire why they have not been used, and to encourage closer cooperation between statisticians interested in the development models and those involved directly in the design and analysis of clinical trials. It's not moving, so do we need to admit someone? Oh, there. Is
that the right one?
Yeah. Thank you. So after saying the what and the why, he says, okay, he describes these two big ideas back in 1985. The first one he calls data-dependent allocation. I would probably call this response-adaptive or response-adaptive allocation nowadays. So basically, he said, well, what Villar did in 1985 is he presented a two-arm trial with binary responses, and he compared several rules or designs to assign patients to the different treatments. Within those five, of course, Villar compared equal and fixed sample size. He also compared several rules of sequential early stopping. And then he added one final rule that in which he kept the total sample size fixed. And then he allowed responses to inform how these patients should be allocated sequentially, with the idea of minimizing unexpected number of failures due to assigning patients to a potentially inferior treatment. Now, this is what we would call response-adaptive designs or response-adaptive randomization if these are randomized. What Villar concluded in that paper was that sequential stopping and data-dependent allocation rules or designs considerably reduce the mean number of failures in a trial due to inferior treatments. Now, Peter explains this and said in the paper, I'm not going to describe, there's lots of papers falling within this, but there's basically two types of data-dependent allocation back then. One he referred to as play-the-winner rules. In the play-the-winner type of rules, which were earn-based designs, the relative proportion in which we assign patients to treatment remains constant over time. So we tend to favor one of the arms, but we do this in a constant way. As opposed to this, the rule proposed by Villar, he says, is an adaptive rule that will try to progressively allow more and more patients to receive the apparent treatment. So he was making this distinction between doing this in a constant way, doing this increasingly to benefit patients over trial. At that point, Peter Armitage also makes a distinction and says, this is very different from covariate adjusted allocation, where we use prognostic covariates and we try to use that information to attain some form of balance in the sample. The data is different, and the aim to do this is different from data-dependent allocation. So moving on, then he says, I really like how he introduced decision theoretic models, and in the sense that he said most of the data-dependent allocation rules that have been discussed have the main motivation to minimize the number of subjects that receive the inferior treatment in the trial. But if one is also trying to ensure error control, which was something that people were discussing in the sense of having a minimal level of discrimination between the treatments, ensuring type 1 error control, then future patients are likely to receive the superior treatment as well. And if we start thinking of current and future patients, one could easily think that the goal of the clinical trial should be to optimize the choice of treatment for both patients in the trial and patients outside the trial. And if we do that, then we need to introduce this concept of patient horizon. What is the patient population that we're trying to benefit? And the first type of paper that was trying to do this kind of decision theoretic model of let's find the solution, the optimal allocation strategy that optimizes patient outcome for the patient population was a paper by Colton in 1963. And there were several variants of papers along this. And then Peter continues and says, if we think that we would want to optimize every allocation, patient after patient for a finite population, then the problem can now be seen as a two-arm bandit problem for a finite horizon. The solution to this can in principle be obtained by dynamic programming methods, but in practice, the computation involved is prohibitive except for trivially small horizons. That was in 1985. So after presenting the two main ideas, then Peter writes a section that says how he felt the 1985 state of methodology was. And he writes, these are quotations from the paper, interest in methodology of clinical trials is probably higher now than ever before. In most respects, the modern clinical trial differs little from the pioneering trials of the 1940s. He then mentions that for trials that will have a long-term follow-up and will require a larger sample size, there's a lot of research going around organizational aspect of multi-centered trials and organizing protocols and so on, and there's a research mentioned around these aspects. He then discusses how the size of the trial is determined by power considerations. And he says, well, this is widely recognized and many elements involved are arbitrary. But he says this is a way of starting the conversation and making everyone aware of the consequences of the size of the sample size. He then moves on to say, well, until the mid-1970s, sequential methods for clinical trials had been developed with this assumption of patient after patient or fully sequential types of design. He says this is a rather exacting requirement, and partly for this reason, sequential methods were used in only a small fraction of all trials. But more recently, particularly following work from McPherson and Pocock, it has been realized that a multi-stage or group sequential plan will often be more attractive. So what were the stumbling blocks? What were the reasons in 1985 why these two ideas were not used? So Peter wrote, I only know of one use of data-dependent allocation, and this is by Zelen, a lung cancer trial, and none for horizon models. Armitage asked himself, has this been because clinical trial statisticians have not been open to novel suggestions? And he answers, well, no, unlikely, because sequential monitoring with error control and adaptive procedures for balancing covariates have been uptaken in practice. Although he does recognize there is a vested interest in preserving the status quo for establishing successful scientific teams, he quickly discards that it's not that people do not want to use these ideas. He then considers specific difficulties with both decision theoretic models and data-dependent allocation. So the way he presented this was he started by saying specific limitations for decision theoretic models, and then he went on for additional, that is on top of the ones that decision theoretic models can have, for data-dependent allocation in general. So for decision theoretic models, what he said was, there is an essential problem of this kind of model seeing the trial as an acceptance or a selection procedure in which there is a absolute final and clear-cut decision that will be made after the trial. And he says, phase 2 trial is clearly this kind of trial because we are screening lots of compounds and we will make a decision, compounds that don't go to phase 3 will be dropped. But phase 3 has a more diffuse purpose and the decision is not so clear-cut. And there are many other considerations, cost and informing decision-making and so on. So he was saying this is something that's not consistent with the way the decision theoretic models are thought at this point. The second thing that he mentions, and this is mentioned twice, is ethical problems. Which are these ethical problems? Well, with the loss function and with this idea of optimizing everyone in the population, should we give people in the population the same weight? Are the patients in the trial the same as patients outside the trial? And these will introduce unnecessary arbitrariness. We need to decide how we're going to do this. Either we weight everyone the same or we have to do it in a different way, but this is not clear-cut. And this opens the conversation of individual versus collective ethics and concepts like an indifference zone for changing practice. He then moves on to say, in terms of specification of parameters, he says there's not much more assumptions than what we make when we do a sample size calculation, except for two. We need to specify the horizon, and we need to specify a prior distribution for the treatment effect. So these are two things that these models need. When he then goes on to data-dependent allocation, he mentions ethics again, mainly in terms of what would happen if the data-dependent allocation can result in a highly unequal allocation, something like 9-to-1. And even if we mask the clinician to the 9-to-1, the clinician inherently knows what might be happening and might feel uncomfortable with that kind of imbalance. So this is something that it's an ethical matter, but can also be considered a design matter. Do you need to have that kind of imbalance in these designs? He also comments on the importance of randomization And the nice thing is that he mentions this in relation to temporal trends in the patient characteristics, and possibly induced by the design as well, because the possibility of a patient understanding that later on is a higher chance of getting a treatment than earlier on. And if there's any possibility of controlling when to come into the trial, that can induce a trend in itself in the patient characteristics. So he was very visionary in pointing that out. He also then says, well, whatever we do, we need to have a design that is sufficiently easy to explain, and where the effect of the design on the precision of the treatment effect estimate can be clearly understood, because we do need to be able to do that. So at this point, I'll move on to what has changed. So this was Peter's paper. It was 10 pages long, 6 sections. It's really nice to read, and it's very insightful. Now what I will do is what my opinion is on what has changed and what remains the same. So the first thing that has changed is the uptake of ideas in practice, where he said in the past 20 years, this has found no application whatsoever. I don't think this is the same. It's still not every trial will use these ideas, but there's much more uptake of what it was when he wrote the paper in 1985. So in terms of data depending on response adaptive designs, there is a paper that reviewed a decade from 2003 to 2023 and found at least 35 registered trials where the protocol uses some form of data-dependent allocation. We, in our group, and this is thanks to Lucas, my PhD student, Lucas Pin, we have a repository of identified, we have identified 23 of these with all, and put the protocol and all the information that we have so that people can have a look and use them. So it's no longer zero. There are trials using this, and I think this is a lower bound of their use, because they're mostly used in phase 2, and this is what we could find from publicly available information. So it's changed, and maybe it will continue to change. Something else that I think has changed is the type of data-dependent allocation design that were either play the winner or adaptive. The field moved on quite a lot since then, and there were abundant theoretical work to develop other types of designs, asymptotically optimal procedures, particularly by Hu and Rosenberger. All their work, what they do is they try to give procedures that have these, given a degree of discrimination between 2 treatments, we try to reduce the average number of patients receiving the inferior arm, and they tell us how to design them, but also how to best asymptotically analyze this. Some of these ideas are extended to adaptive rules or urn designs in certain cases, and a paper by May and Flournoy look at the asymptotic behavior of more extreme urns. But also there are other objectives. It's not just about minimizing expected failures. Nowadays, there are other ideas that come from the optimal or Niemann ideas, information theoretic designs, in which we try to guide assignments, not just to minimize failures, but to have a broader objective that can better reflect what the trial wants to do. And there's a paper by Pavel and Thomas that you can read for information gain type of designs. Now, this is the part that I think has changed the most. So Peter wrote, 2-arm bandit problem, computationally involved is prohibitive except for small trivial horizons. And this is where one of the things that I looked in my 2015 paper. So this, when this paper was written a few years before, Gittings and Jones in 1979 had come up with a solution that was groundbreaking for the multi-arm bandit problem, because they managed to show that the solution by dynamic programming was equivalent to an index function that was a bit of a decomposed divide and conquer strategy. And if one uses that approach, then the computational complexity of the multi-arm problem is solved by a Gittings index is much better than one by dynamic programming. And the picture I'm showing is the number of operations for a 3-arm bandit solved either by brute force, that is enumerating all the final states and finding the optimal solution, or using dynamic programming, or using the Gittings index as a function of t being the number of patients that we have. So clearly for trials with more than 18 or something, Gittings index will be computationally more efficient than dynamic programming to find this solution. So this was something that had been done in 1979, so before Peter wrote this paper, but it took quite a while for people to be convinced and to know the results of the Gittings theorem in general. Beyond the index theory, computationally is also not, what did he mean by trivially small? So when Peter wrote this in 1985, he cited Don Berry in 1978, and what Don could compute for the 2-arm bandit on a with a base with what was available at that point in an Atari computer and with the basic software was a maximum trial size of 100. Before that, there were 25. That was the maximum that they could get. And now this has changed over the years. And the latest Julia program in a PC can get this kind of solution that Dawn got up to 100 to almost 4,400 or even 6,000 in the latest iteration. So two unbounded problems optimally are no longer impossible as they were back then. And this is due to the computational advances. Now, understanding bias and induced by the data-dependent allocation. So this was very important. And I think the earlier on that followed this was by Steve Code, who was a student of Peter, and Ivanova in 2001. They worked out the bias for play the winner types of design. There's more recent work trying to quantify the statistical bias of point estimates induced by data-dependent allocation and adaptivity in general. There's a nice thesis by Sheen in 2020, and there's a paper by Jack Bowden and Lorenzo Trippa in 2017. In addition to this, there's two tutorial papers on the topic in Statistics in Medicine by David Robertson, which also delve into the effects of bias of adaptation. What for me is less clearly understood is the effects of data-dependent sampling in terms of covariates, also confidence intervals in general, and or the effect of the estimand. If we adapt and we're interested in a different estimand, does this change the effect on the bias because we change the estimand? So he also said endpoint types hadn't changed that much from 1940s to 1985. Has this changed? I think this has changed. The digitalization of certain outcomes, for example, actigraphy, is driving the inclusion of novel forms of endpoints. And these new data and new outcome measures bring new challenges. And Mia Tagni and myself wrote a paper on this. As well, digital experiments done by Google and other tech companies make this fully sequential data-dependent allocation where we have a fixed sample size and we can do things pretty quickly, quite the perfect field for these kind of algorithms. And that's why they've been uptaken in that field much more. So the last thing I think that he said is interest in methodology of clinical trials is probably higher now than ever before. I think this has changed in the sense that it's higher now than it was before. So that's a good thing. And I think COVID-19 pandemic drove a lot of that interest. And Sue will tell us more about this and how about adaptive designs more generally in the 21st century. So what remains the same? And this is where I see Armitage's vision present in today's trial. I really think the type of trial for which the optimal designs that he was describing where they fit is phase 2. And I think he was very right in saying that. He also said the consideration of power requirements when using these designs is particularly important for phase 3. I think this also remains the same. I think he also was very, what remains true is the importance of randomization wherever possible, even if we do not do them with sealed envelopes anymore. But wherever we can, randomization is a good thing. As I said before, the risk of trends induced or not by the adaptive design is something very relevant, particularly for platform trials that take a long time and where this is something that one needs to take into account in their analysis. The ethical issues with highly unequal allocations in general will remain, and this is something that needs to be discussed with ethicists and in general. The idea that data-dependent allocation combined with early stopping might be superior than early stopping on its own in terms of reducing patients to the inferior treatments. I think that was also something that was hinted in his paper and that remains present today. The final one is what he said, the willing agreement of the clinical investigator is a sine qua non to implement advanced or novel designs in practice, which I think remains valid today. In order to implement any of these adaptive, innovative designs, we do have to have a clinician and a PI fully on board with what we're doing. I think this hasn't changed at all. So final remarks. In February this year, we had a meeting here on response adaptive randomization, and we were talking about a paper that we had just published with David and others, and the discussion of this paper. So I cannot give a talk around these ideas without saying that these ideas have been long debated. And this is a picture of us here in this venue, all the speakers and discussants, and Chris Jennison is there as well. So these ideas have long been proposed, and they have long been discussed. And often this debate, particularly for data-dependent allocation or response-adapted randomization, has been presented as extreme viewpoints, either advocating for a universal or complete avoidance of some of these adaptive designs. Some of these positions have also been less influenced by the current state of the theory than by other factors, such as ethical considerations. And we have a Save the Date flyer on April 24th, where we are going to hopefully discuss these things with the ethicists. So please save the date. But having read a lot of this debate over the years and having written that other paper, I want to finish my talk by pointing out how Peter demonstrated in this specific paper, not just the visionary perspective in the things that he and how he saw clinical trials developing, but also his scientific approach when articulating his position on this issue. So he said, in my view, the issue is not clear-cut, either in favor or against these methods. I am sure that there are situations where neither a horizon model nor an adaptive allocation should be considered. Equally, I suspect that there are situations where modest experiments in methodology could be carried out. And since the willing agreement of the clinical investigator is a sine qua non, advances are likely to be more successful in trials under the local management of 1 or 2 physicians in a center than in large multi-center trial controlled by a committee of investigators. But I think what I take from here is his position of being constructive and being quite balanced in how he expressed his position in this debate. And to finish, I want to thank everyone in our group, Efficient Study Design, that's in the picture, that continues to work in these ideas and trying to develop efficient study design for clinical trials. Here are references, and I want to finish by thanking Brian and Alison for organizing this Armitage workshop and many before. And this is a picture of Armitage 2017, where Bill Rosenberger was the Armitage lecturer, and I was part of the program. So thank you very much.